In this video I'm going to talk about the do's and don'ts of drawing, some things that people tend to do when they start out. So I've got Photoshop open here and I've got a basic sort of brush that's kind of like a pencil, and sometimes when you start drawing you'll just immediately start thinking about what kind of shapes you want to make that are the easiest to make in your mind without observing too much. You may come up with like something very simple and pretty bad proportions, and being a little bit kind of simplified with everything. Sometimes you'll even break joints into too many areas or too few, and everything is just very rigid and initially just committed to the paper. Now that's kind of like what would happen if you were learning the ABCs of drawing, and you didn't really know the rest of the alphabet. You were stuck with just A, B, C, right? Just very simple shapes. Put them on the page and the whole thing is done. A, B, C, right? But really, you should be thinking way beyond that. Like, you've got much more room to maneuver when you think about the placement and position of things. Like where the nose is, where the mouth is, where the chin is, where the jaw is, where the ear is, where the neck is at the back, the rib area, where the arm comes off that area. And I'm being very loose with everything so that it's easy to make changes with a heavier weight. And this is still a simplified humanoid type form, but I have the ability to change some things here. And after a lot of observation, I know that the arm has this bulge here before it gets to the straighter part of the arm, and this helps sell it as real arm. There's going to be some foreshortening here, that is that the arm is coming towards you, and then it reaches the wrist area, and it creates some of the hand where the fingers are, and then there'll be some fingers that come off that area and then they'll kind of come into each other, and the thumb will be somewhere back here. So a lot of these things have to be imagined but also planned about how things are going to look. So I want the wrist to come in a bit. I need to think about how it's posed, otherwise it might look awkward if I start to just draw this like that and I'm not sure of how that's supposed to look. Everything looks kind of robotic and awkward, but if I'm much more kind of natural about things and don't worry too much and go for a more neutral type pose, that will definitely be easier to make. It'll be easier to make changes as well. I want to avoid being too hard with the pencil because then I'm kind of committed to everything. Okay, so I've got the rib cage here, seen a little bit of the front of the chest and then the other side. This could be like a bar. It's leaning on maybe some sort of surface. A little bit of perspective in there and so on. Okay, so there's maybe some proportions out, but at least it's not just simplified. So 3, we want to make something like this, but bearing this in mind. So we're going to construct the head where the feet are, gives us the two extremes to fit everything else in. So if we know where the feet are, halfway is going to be roughly where the hips are. And where you position the hips is up to you, whether you want to put them down low or up high. I'll put them up high to give it a little bit more of a superhero type proportion. And then the knees. So placing things like at halfway points makes it really easy. Roughly halfway here we've got the chest. Let's do a little bit of a neck and the shoulders here. And then we put the elbows somewhere here. So these are just marks that I'm making to give me an idea where everything should go. I'm doing some nice little curves to give me a different form because it's kind of like a chain link. you'll have one area goes like this, an area like that, and so on. So we've got the kind of rounded bit up here, then it goes to the straight part here where the muscles connect, and then this part here, and it kind of goes straight again, and then goes to the hand like that. Okay, and then when people draw the upper body and they're not too sure how it goes, they might just draw it straight like this. It does look a little bit like a robot, but most of the time there's kind of these two shapes. There's a shape where the rib cage sort of ends, and then it comes down, and then there's kind of like an oblique muscle here. So you get a little bit of a curve, not as curvaceous as a woman obviously, but there's a bit of a muscle here, and that tends to go right down towards the groin, and then you get a lot of muscle parts connecting up here as well. I'm not going to get into any detail of what those muscles are called, but it's just a good thing to like pay attention to when you're drawing these kind of things. Now the pec muscles here, or the chest of a male, these connect right in under the arm. If I was to lift that arm up, like if this arm is to be lifted up like this, okay, like all the muscles kind of go round, and basically this pec would go away up in here under the armpit almost. The armpit's there, and you would get this here. You can check this out in the mirror yourself, and you'll see, you know, this kind of thing this type thing happening. Okay, but it all kind of stretches up. Now the proportions are a bit off here, but you get the idea. Okay, so there's a lot going on there, and see, as I build this up, I'm getting this natural line weight. It's only because I'm starting with the lines being really light, and as I'm more certain about those lines, I can do a little bit more line weight to them. Okay. Now I'm still learning anatomy myself, so some of these things might not be as accurate as they could be, but over time these are the kind of things that we'd all improve on with practice. Might be a few different forms here. You see, as I'm not sure about things, it's a good idea for me to go and check out reference. Otherwise I'll have so much indecision that I just end up with a really thick noisy line, and that's the worst thing that you can do in drawing, is to totally trying to correct something that much that you just draw darker and darker and darker until you end up with something like this, and then you realize that you have to balance the whole drawing to be like this, so you're just throwing in some random marks in places to make it look finished, but you're rushing all these things to make it look like you meant it, like you're trying to keep the drawing somewhat cohesive to itself, but none of these marks are really doing any justice. So that's kind of like the ABC. This will be the D, E, F, and then this will be the G, the H, and the I. So you're going through these sort of learning stages. Okay, I'm just going to clear that. And let's say I wanted to draw an apple, right? So what you normally do in ABC mode, like back to nursery, or you know, kind of with your elementary school, your primary schools, your first school when you're literally 5 or 6 years old, and they ask you to draw an apple, you're probably going to do something like this, right? That is a basic apple. Now you can see there's fundamental shapes here that come into play, you know, at stage D, E, F, right? Kind of like DF is more like you're approaching high school, or your later years of primary, and you should be thinking of, okay, well, these shapes are good starting points, but they're not the end result. You know, I can use those, and you can kind of like bring in a little bit more to it. Say, okay, well, it dimples in a bit here, and something happens there like that, and this is more of a kind of shape like this. Okay, so that's you using these fundamental basic building blocks to make the shape. And then 3, you're at the GH, the I, the high school. Okay, and yeah, you're going to use much more confident big shapes. you'll be observing the dip that you see in the apple. There might be a more regular shape to it, a little kind of bump as it comes in, kind of change the shape at the bottom there. And you'll have the stem coming out, maybe a little bit of a top to it, and it tends to get a little bit thinner, and then there'll be a leaf comes off there like that, and you can really kind of give that an interesting shape. And you'd be thinking about where the dark areas are and where the light areas are. You can even go a step further and shade the background to make the actual object stand out. As long as you're kind of complete with that, it won't look like it's part of the object if you go just a little bit further. Okay, then you would be starting to shade things in. That's more at stage JKL. This is when you're kind of out of high school and you're working in the real world. You're going to be using all those techniques that you've learned, and you're going to be using a little bit of speed as well, and confidence in what you're doing. You'll be adding some shadows, and you really want this to look good because you're up against loads of people in the world, and they're all amazing at drawing, and you basically want yours to be the best one. So you're going to use all those techniques that you've learned to make this look good. You're going to have a nice coarse shadow. Your shadows are all going to follow the form of the object. I'm going to use some nice interesting cross hatching. It is going to take a little bit longer to get the results that you want for this kind of thing. And you can use whatever technique works for you. Maybe the odd bit of detail in there. So eventually when you build this up enough, it's going to look good, but it's all down to how much time you put into it, being very patient. You see in this case I can actually shade the background just a little bit darker to make the actual object stand out instead of using an outline. Even though I'm trying to match the outline tone a little bit here and there. I want to be careful to continue this type of shading as I go further away from the object so that it doesn't look too contrasted, because your eye is going to jump to that contrast. So as you improve with your drawing, you're going to think about all these things that are going to impress other people, and it's that kind of attention to detail that shows your experience and gives people the confidence in your ability to draw. Now, even though I'm drawing digitally here, there is skills that are transferable to pencil, such as using smudging techniques, either a smudging pencil, and in some cases you can use your finger, but you have to be very careful that you don't ruin the drawing just by having dirty smudge marks everywhere. In some cases you want to tone the whole object darker so that you have room for highlights. The same applies when you're drawing dark areas, to start with a light pencil so that you have room to go darker. Like I said before, if you immediately went to a dark pencil, and you lean heavy, you kind of like gave yourself no way out with this type of line work, and you then have to make the most of it. And sometimes you can do that, but that might be just a little bit too stark and not very pleasing to the eye. But using that in a final drawing for line weight is a good idea, especially if you've got a lot of shading already in place, but it's important not to put it everywhere, just in areas that make sense, like areas where there's shadow. A little bit of texture goes a long way, because the direction that you shade in gives a sense of the direction that surface might be going. For example, shading in this apple in a spherical sense, going across the way, is going to give it that rounded look. Drawing up the way, round, almost like you're creating little basketball type lines going around a ball. So you're kind of wrapping around the shape. It takes a lot longer to shade this way, but the results can be nicer if you're quite careful with it. You can also shade in circles, kind of circular motion, and that can give a nice kind of woven fabric type of look. I like to break it up with all types of shading, a little bit of cross hatching, a little bit shading with the form, and a little bit of circular motion. I also tend to use a smudging tool as well, so I could switch to the smudge mode here and kind of simulate that effect with a soft setting. The only problem with this is it tends to lose that texture a little bit, and I need to make sure that I do it across the whole object. And I'm being careful to follow the direction, otherwise I'll lose that sense of form. Again, even though I'm drawing digitally, it's possible to use some smudging pencils or smudging tools to get this kind of effect. It's important to keep the texture of your object balanced and not too rough in some areas and not in others, unless the object asks for it, but in most cases each individual object will have its own particular shading technique, and maybe that single drawing itself will have its own shading technique used through the whole drawing. I'm just breaking up this background a little bit to make it more interesting, but I'm trying to avoid keeping it as detailed as the foreground, just so that it holds. I can now erase out any lines that I don't want to see as part of the final drawing, because I know that I've been very light with these and they should be easy to erase. I can even erase all the way until it's almost the same color as the page. I could go ahead and add even more texture detail if I had different different pencils and things. This might just be for effect, but you see the more time I spend on this, it starts to look better and better. I've gave it good planning, so I don't have to worry about the shape. I don't have to go back to that stage. I don't have to waste time by trying to make it again. The planning's good. The underlying structure is good enough to work from. And now I'm just adding details and things. Again, I'm using digital media, but a lot of these things can be done with erasing areas out. As long as you're soft with a pencil, you can get some of these things back to some degree. That pretty much wraps it up for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and hope you learned a few techniques that you feel you can use in your own drawing. Thanks for watching. Bye.